The morning sun cast long shadows across Naval Base Coronado as Ivy Carter stepped off the gravel access path onto the concrete edge of Dock 2. Her right leg stiffened slightly with each step, a reminder of her last official mission, but her posture remained level, disciplined. She carried a sealed diagnostics case, its corners dulled by time and weight, looking more suited for a server room than a dive compound. At 34, Ivy had spent 12 years perfecting the art of being essential while remaining invisible. Her gray undershirt bore no insignia, no unit badge, no assigned color stripe. Just a laminated support tag with a red border, the kind given to civilian contractors and technical staff who weren't quite military, weren't quite welcome. The morning briefing tent buzzed with the familiar cadence of confidence and caffeine. SEAL Team 7 was preparing for another training exercise, their voices carrying across the dock in tight, overlapping commands. Ivy passed two men loading crates onto a trailer. One looked up, did a quick double-take at her blank shoulder, then said something low to his partner that made them both smile. She'd heard it all before. The jokes, the assumptions, the casual dismissal that came with being the woman who fixed things, but didn't belong to any particular unit. 6 months ago, she'd been Lieutenant Commander Ivy Carter, lead dive specialist for the Navy's experimental recovery program. One failed communication relay during a prototype test. One scapegoat needed for budget cuts. And suddenly she was just Ivy support staff with an unclear mandate and a bunk in the temporary quarters. That gear's not going to sort itself. Barked to Lieutenant Jake Morrison, a young officer with more authority than experience. He pointed toward a pile of coiled tether line beside the rail. And if you don't know what to do, don't touch anything expensive. Ivy nodded once, not too fast, not too slow, and set her diagnostics case beside the closest crate. She knelt without a word and began working through the tangled coils, her gloved hands flattening kinks with quiet efficiency. Around her, the base hummed with purpose she was no longer officially part of. Laughter echoed from the command tent where a group had gathered around a monitor, watching helmet footage from a recent dive. Someone yelled across the pad, "Don't let her near the com panel, boys. That thing's still under warranty." The ripple of amusement that followed hit Ivy like a familiar weight. She found the next kink in the line and smoothed it flat with her palm, her movements deliberate and precise. Her boots, though clean, were older than anyone else's on the dock. The laces had been rethreaded so many times the eyelets had worn. Bright, a scuff ran across the left toe. The leather softened from years of use in places the Navy no longer sent her. In the side pouch of her belt, wrapped in waterproof laminate, lay her real credentials, an annotated tide chart she'd compiled. Over 8 years of active diving. Every notation represented hours of research, personal observation, and data the official models had missed. No one had asked for it. No one knew it existed. By midday, the sun had drawn sweat from every dry surface. A SEAL team came jogging. Up from the beach trail, wetsuits unzipped and hanging low on their hips. One spotted Ivy rewrapping the last coil and shouted to his friend, "Hey, civilian logistics is getting her steps in." Another added, "Keep her away from the pressure. Valves, unless we want to see a liftoff drill." Ivy didn't react. She'd learned that responding only gave them more material. Instead, she picked up her diagnostics case and moved it 2 feet to where the shade line had shifted. Opening the top, she checked the interior seals and began reviewing the checklist taped to the lid. Her handwriting covered every margin small. Precise marks in dark blue ink that told the story of someone who documented everything because no one else would remember her contributions. As teams rotated through gear checks and lunch cycles, Ivy moved to the back of the staging tent. Beside a half-unloaded crate of backup fins, she clipped a spare hook to her belt and adjusted inventory straps without being asked. A passing technician looked at her curiously, You from systems or medical? He asked. Support, she answered. He grunted and kept walking. Support meant everything and nothing, the catch-all category for people whose expertise was valued, but whose presence wasn't quite wanted. The command canopy grew loud that afternoon as ice chests opened and closed. Radios crackled, and someone rolled out a mat to stretch. One of the dive leaders leaned against a cooler and gestured toward Ivy with a plastic fork. She's someone's cousin, he said. Nah, another replied. Probably doing her hours for whatever admin pool handles tech overflow. Let her organize. A toolbox or something. Ivy continued checking clips on sonar cables, her movements methodical and unhurried. She'd heard variations of this conversation dozens of times. The speculation about who she was, why she was there, what strings had been pulled to get her assigned to active units. The truth was simpler and more complex. She knew things they needed to know, but admitting that would mean acknowledging they'd discarded someone valuable. Near the end of the work cycle, a loudspeaker called for command staff to report to briefing. The crew moved quickly, boots echoing across concrete. Ivy stayed behind, kneeling to double-check a clip on a sonar cable, stowed beneath a tarp. In the sudden quiet, with only wind tugging at the fabric overhead, she allowed herself one slow exhale. She slid the tide chart from her pouch and looked at it without unfolding, then put it back. Patience, her father had taught her during those childhood sailing lessons. The ocean reveals its secrets to those who wait and watch. An hour later, lights came on inside the hangar, casting a soft glow across the floor. Laughter rose again as someone turned music on low. Ivy sat alone at the end of the dock, legs drawn up, boots braced against a steel pipe. The water moved beneath her in rhythmic pulses, and her hands rested on the diagnostics, case closed, latch tight, filled with knowledge no one had bothered to ask about. The sun dipped behind the communication tower. No one looked out the window to see her sitting there, silhouetted against the darkening sky. She didn't need them to see her. Not yet. But soon, when their expensive equipment failed and their official charts proved inadequate, they would need what she carried in that weathered case and laminated chart. Ivy Carter had learned the hard way that being right wasn't enough. But being right and being patient, that was a combination that could change everything. The quarters assigned to Ivy were barely wider than the cot inside them. Pale paint peeled near the window frame where salt wind had worked its way through supposedly sealed joints. There was no mirror, no wall decor, no radio, just a cot. A folded blanket, a narrow table, and a lockbox beneath it. The overhead light hummed softly, but she didn't turn it on. Evening light through the half-curtained window was enough. She set her sealed diagnostics case against the wall where shadows felt deepest, then unzipped the side pouch of her duffel. The dive harness emerged first dull black, frayed at the edges, with buckles she'd replaced by hand. One strap had been shortened and restitched to accommodate an old shoulder injury. The fit was hers alone, modified through years of adaptation that no standard Navy gear could match. Folding it over her knee, she checked every threading without haste. Each clip turned smooth, each seal clicked into place with familiar precision. This harness had accompanied her through 87 official dives and countless training exercises. It had been her constant companion during the prototype recovery missions that had made her career and later destroyed it. The second item she drew out was a coil of rope, its ends heat-wrapped, the middle marked with faded tape. She sat on the cot, boots still on, and began threading loops through her fingers. The rhythm was unhurried, overhand, clove hitch, bowline. Her breathing settled into the motion as muscle memory took over. She paused between each knot to inspect it by touch rather than sight, then untied it and began again. This ritual had started during her first deployment aboard the USS Hampton, when sleep wouldn't come and her hands needed something to do. Her father had taught her these knots during weekend sailing trips on Chesapeake Bay, back when she was 12 and convinced she'd become a marine biologist. "Knot work's the first skill I'll teach you," he'd said, his weathered hands guiding hers, "not to earn a badge, but to stay alive." On the narrow table sat her notebook, a flat, soft-covered volume wrapped in tape at the spine. She opened it and smoothed the page with the side of her hand. The contents read like a technical manual written in shorthand. Tidal patterns, reef contours, current shifts near pressure ridges. Each diagram was sketched with precision margins, filled with data that had taken years to collect. Some notations had faded from sweat and seawater. She recopied them every few days, not for memorization, but to preserve the reference. Some of the handwriting wasn't hers. Commander Patricia Reeves had contributed notes during joint exercises off San Diego. Lieutenant Marcus Webb had shared depth readings from his helmet camera after a particularly challenging recovery near Point Loma. Both had been reassigned. After the budget cuts, both had left Ivy their data because they understood what the brass didn't. That institutional knowledge walked away with the people who carried it. Reaching beneath the cot, she pulled out a small cloth-wrapped object. Inside was a brass weight the size of a plum, its surface worn smooth from years of submersion. It had been bolted once to the inside of prototype recovery capsule, RC-47. Ivy had unbolted it herself the night she cleared her personal gear from the hangar. She'd carried it from the base without anyone noticing, walking out just past midnight, while rain soaked her flight jacket. Her hands had still smelled of oil and battery acid from the final equipment check. The reassignment email had come 6 hours after the debrief. No warning, no appeal process, no acknowledgement of 8 years of flawless service. One test mission, one communication relay that failed due to equipment she hadn't selected, and her name topped the blame list. They'd called it a procedural adjustment. She hadn't called it anything. The brass weight rolled warm in her palm, calling up memories not in images, but in sequence. The excitement of being selected for the experimental program, the months of training with equipment that pushed the boundaries of underwater recovery. The pride of her team when they successfully retrieved their first real-world target. The slow realization that success made some people nervous, especially when it came from sources they couldn't control. She set the weight beside her notebook and flipped to the last page, where her tide models branched into hand-drawn tables. These curves represented coastal shelves that no base model mapped accurately. She knew that from experience, had felt the pull of unmapped currents during night dives when official charts showed calm water. Outside, a truck passed on the gravel road, tires crunching. The base quieted early here. SEALs rose at dawn, training. Cycles reset every 48 hours, and most personnel were asleep by 10. No one would knock. No one would come by. Her reassignment had placed her in a gray area of the command structure technically assigned, but functionally invisible. She returned the brass weight to its cloth and slid it beneath the cot, then took up the rope again. With eyes closed, she tied a double figure 8, checked it, untied it, started over. The process no longer required conscious thought, but she still counted each motion silently. Her breathing remained steady even when tightness rose in her chest. The familiar weight of being discarded by an institution she'd served faithfully. Later, she unrolled her tide chart. Unlike the notebook, this chart had traveled. Its corners had been pressed into gear bins, cargo holds, and clipboards across 3 duty stations. She'd updated it after every operation involving live currents, overlaying old routes against new drift data. Most of her observations were ignored in formal briefings, dismissed as anecdotal rather than systematic. She made one new mark, a soft pencil line drawn across a pressure contour where last week's training exercise had gone sideways. She'd seen the warning signs in the water movement, had tried to mention it to the dive supervisor. He waved her off without looking at her data. 20 minutes later, 2 divers had nearly been swept off the reef shelf when an unexpected current surge hit their descent line. The official after-action report blamed unpredictable conditions. Ivy's chart, had anyone bothered to look, would have shown those conditions were entirely predictable for anyone who understood the seasonal patterns. She folded the chart and resealed it, working the stubborn zipper until it closed properly. Her harness went onto the wall hook. Boots came off with laces tucked inside. She didn't check her messages or look at the time. There was no calendar. In the room, no clock, no schedule to meet beyond her own preparation. What she did because it would matter when something failed and no one else knew where to begin. In the stillness of that small room, beneath the salt-stained window, and the hum of the unseen light, Ivy practiced what no one had asked her to remember. Because when the time came, there would be no time to teach it again. Outside, the ocean continued its eternal rhythm against the pylons. Inside, a woman who'd been cast aside, prepared for the moment when being forgotten would become her greatest advantage. The rope coiled smooth in her hands. The knots formed and dissolved, and patience settled over her like depth-heavy, encompassing, and utterly still. The morning began under low cloud cover, the air heavy with moisture that clung to gear and skin alike. The compound moved with practiced urgency as 2 rigid hull boats launched, their engines echoing against the water. Inside the primary support tent, screens blinked to life while Exercise Commander-Chief Robert Wheeler shouted final checks to his team. The objective was posted on the whiteboard in bold letters: simulate recovery of a dummy warhead sunk in a trench 60 meters below. Visibility restricted, current unstable, 30-minute window to locate and secure. Standard training exercise, run monthly to keep team sharp. Ivy stood at the back of the tent behind a stack of sealed bins, holding an empty clipboard she didn't need. She'd already loaded calibration files into the sonar unit the night before, run diagnostics on the beacon trigger, and fine-tuned the sweep range for the trench depth. No one had thanked her. She hadn't expected it. Across the tent, 2 operators double-checked their dive computers while another adjusted his mask seal. The mission seemed routine until it wasn't. "First team is dropping," Chief Wheeler announced, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who'd run this exercise dozens of times. Depth readings coming through clean. Ivy stepped aside, out of the main traffic flow, and watched the screens. The sonar sweep painted its familiar arc across the monitors, pulsing steadily as the divers descended. She noticed the drift immediately small, no more than 1.7 degrees northeast, but enough to matter. With every meter they dropped, it would get worse. Her hand went to her jacket pocket where the tide chart rested, folded and familiar. She didn't pull it out, just traced its outline through the fabric. The trench curved down there, following a natural shelf that the official Navy charts showed as a straight descent. She'd mapped the real contours herself during off-duty dives, using borrowed equipment and her own oxygen. Team 1 is descending, visibility below 10 meters, the communications technician reported. Minimal current, pressure holding steady. Depth at 37. Ivy watched the rightmost monitor as the ping stuttered slightly. The grid alignment blinked red for half a second, then steadied. Signal delay. GPS input starting to drift. The trench was already pulling them off course, but no one else seemed to notice. Reading negative return, bottom visuals unstable, came the lead diver's voice through the comm, edged with static. Can't confirm. Beacon source. Chief Wheeler leaned over the radio console. Stay on course, hold drift. Switch to pattern 2. Ivy moved closer, her voice low but clear. The trench is pulling northeast. You'll lose contact in 5 minutes. Wheeler didn't turn. Support staff, stay back. She didn't argue, but she kept watching. 2 minutes later, both dive teams reported unstable readings. The beacon signal vanished completely. GPS showed their positions scattered along the reef shelf like marbles rolled off a table. The carefully planned exercise was dissolving into chaos. Signal failure confirmed, the tech reported, his voice tight. GPS reads unreliable. Recommend abort. Wheeler's jaw tensed. Pull them out. Across the tent, someone leaned back in his chair and muttered, "We'll reset when the weather holds." That's when Ivy stepped into full view. She didn't raise her voice or posture for attention. It's still reachable. Silence rippled through the tent like a stone dropped in still water. Wheeler looked up from his console with the expression of someone who'd been interrupted by a janitor during surgery. "Excuse me?" "It's still reachable," she repeated. Same tone, same quiet certainty. Someone laughed under his breath. A younger diver shook his head with the confidence of someone who'd never been wrong about anything that mattered. "You offering to swim it?" "I am." The pause that followed wasn't long. It didn't need to be. Wheeler stared at her like she'd just volunteered to juggle live grenades. "That zone's off-grid. Beacon's dead. You're not cleared for open water entry." "I know where the trench kinks," Ivy said. "I charted the bend 3 weeks ago. The current pulls outward, not under. They're searching the wrong wall." One of the junior officers leaned closer to the sonar display. "We're pulling the team. This isn't your call." Ivy reached into her jacket and pulled out the tide chart. She unfolded it with both hands and laid it flat on the corner table, her movements deliberate and unhurried. "I marked the pressure line. Here, there's a break that forms during surge tide. That's what's pulling your signal." No one moved. The room stayed quiet, except for the whir of the ventilation fan and the slow beep of the depth counter. Wheeler crossed the space slowly and looked at the chart, his eyes following the pencil line she'd drawn across the pressure shelf. It curved against the official training map posted behind the monitors. "You ran this yourself?" he asked. "Yes. Repeated cycles, confirmed against previous dive telemetry." "Your name isn't on any manifest. I didn't ask to be on it." A longer silence followed. Outside, one of the rescue boats was circling back toward the dock, engine pitch rising as it fought the current. Wheeler exhaled slowly, the sound of a man calculating risks he didn't want it to take. "And you're telling me you can make the dive?" She nodded once. "Yes." Another officer scoffed quietly. "We're gonna send the woman who calibrates our gear." Wheeler looked around the room. The sonar unit ping began, fainter and off-axis. His eyes moved back to Ivy's chart, then to the unused rebreather unit hanging beside the gear rack, then to the empty space on the manifest where her name should have been if anyone had bothered to include her. "You think you can find the beacon?" "Blind? I don't need to find it," Ivy said. "I know where it is." The chart stayed on the table. No one touched it, but everyone could see the precision of her notations, the careful measurements that official surveys had missed. Wheeler glanced once more at the monitors showing his scattered teams, then at Ivy's steady, patient expression. "Prep her gear," he said finally. "Get her tethered and ready." A rustle swept through the room, not surprise, exactly, but the sound of assumptions shifting. The woman they dismissed as support staff was about to do what their best divers couldn't. Ivy didn't smile. She turned toward the equipment rack without a word. She had waited for the moment when silence became the only voice that mattered. Now it was time to show them what they'd thrown away. The harness clicked shut across Ivy's chest with a sound that brought back muscle memory from 100 previous dives. She adjusted the straps with practiced precision, looping secondary clips and testing the left shoulder seal where an old injury sometimes caused problems. No one moved to assist her. The crew stood several meters away near the equipment tent, pretending to check gauges while stealing glances at the woman preparing to do what they couldn't. She pulled on her gloves last, flexing her fingers and testing the wrist seals. The rebreather unit hummed quietly behind her shoulder gauge reading full, depth regulator set, pressure equalized. From her side pocket, she removed a small slate, clipped to her personal dive notes. The sketch was hers alone, hand-drawn and waterproofed, showing the trench contours that weren't in any Navy manual. "Come check," called the technician from inside the tent. "Negative on com," Ivy replied. "I'm going silent." Chief Wheeler stepped closer to the platform edge. "Without communication, that's not protocol." "Protocol got your team scattered across the reef," she said, clipping the slate back to her gear. "The current down there will interfere with standard. Come anyway. I'll surface with the beacon, or I won't." She stepped to the platform edge and waited for the wave trough to flatten, then lowered herself into the water without a splash. The cold hit instantly dense, impersonal, unforgiving. It didn't shock her. She'd logged hundreds of hours in worse conditions with inferior equipment. The weight of the harness carried her under smoothly, shoulders folding to streamline her. Descent. At 10 meters, visibility dropped to arm's length. Silt drifted like smoke through her dive light's beam, but she switched the light off. There was nothing to see that her hands couldn't tell her more accurately. She rotated her wrist slightly to maintain heading and began the angled descent her chart had predicted. The current tried to pull her left. She countered with a small fin adjustment, letting the water guide her into the natural channel she'd mapped during her unauthorized reconnaissance dives. At 20 meters, light vanished completely. Only pressure and motion remained. The familiar cocoon of depth that separated real divers from those who merely went underwater. She counted her pulse by feel, monitored her breathing rhythm, and followed the path she'd committed to memory during dozens of practice runs. Her right hand traced a natural rock contour until it hit the ledge exactly where her chart predicted. From there, she turned northeast into the narrow section where the official map showed empty water. The dummy warhead would be on the far side, tilted from its last drop rotation, probably caught in the netting that training exercises never accounted for. Moving by touch alone, her hands found the broken stone ridge, then the tangled synthetic line. There, both hands closed around the metal strut of the capsule. It was smaller than regulation, used only in simulations with no active beacon unless manually triggered. Her fingers found the switch casing, gripped a latch, and turned. Click. Above in the operations tent, the sonar monitor bloomed green. She didn't know that. Didn't need to. She waited 3 seconds to confirm the signal lock, then began her ascent, retracing the contour line with her hands as the current shifted around her. The return journey felt different. Surge tide was beginning, just as her calculations had predicted. She adjusted her pace, adding flutter kicks to maintain neutral buoyancy while the water tried to pull her off course. At 15 meters, she slowed and let the silk cloud drift past her goggles. At 10 meters, she could feel the platform vibration through the water. She surfaced without ceremony, breaking through into sunlight as wind curled across the platform. Edge. No one moved at first. She kicked twice to clear distance from the platform, then reached for the edge rail. A crewman stepped forward to catch her tether line, but hesitated, unsure of protocol for someone who technically wasn't supposed to be in the water. She passed the line to him without speaking and began removing her gear. The rebreather came. Off slowly, her gloves peeled away with a faint hiss. She stepped onto the ramp and stood straight, water streaming from her harness, spine unbent despite the weight she'd carried. Behind her, the tent buzzed with sudden activity. The beacon. Signal pulse strong and clear on multiple monitors. GPS coordinates locked. Recovery teams could now navigate directly to the target using her signal as a guide. Chief Wheeler stood at the back of the tent, one hand resting on the edge of the table. His expression was unreadable, not grateful, not apologetic, just the careful neutrality of someone whose assumptions had been proven spectacularly wrong. Ivy didn't look for acknowledgement. She walked past the line of dive suits, past the folded towels, past the open crate marked recovery equipment, and retrieved her diagnostics case from the corner. Her hands were still wet. She didn't bother drying them. The beacon continued, pulsing its confirmation green light, steady signal, mission accomplished. By the time someone finally spoke, she was already walking away from the platform, her footsteps echoing off concrete as the ocean settled back into its rhythm behind her. Holy hell, someone whispered inside the tent. She actually did it. But Ivy was already gone, disappearing around the corner of the hangar with her equipment case, and the quiet satisfaction of someone who just reminded the world that being overlooked and being incapable were entirely different things. The beacon blinked on, steady and sure. The exercise would continue, and somewhere in the depths, the current continued to flow exactly as she charted it, indifferent to the opinions of those who'd thought they knew better. The dock looked the same the next morning, but the air had changed. The sun came up slower, filtering through clouds with more space between shadows, and the usual morning chaos felt muted. Ivy walked the concrete edge with her dry bag in one hand, nothing clipped to her vest, moving with the same measured pace she'd maintained for months. But this time, people noticed differently. The same SEALs who had joked about her 2 days earlier stepped aside as she passed. They didn't salute, she wasn't an officer anymore, but they moved with the automatic courtesy extended to someone who'd proven themselves when it mattered. One glanced up from his checklist, then immediately looked back down. Another gave a barely perceptible nod that somehow carried more weight than a formal acknowledgement. She reached the staging tent without adjusting her pace. The whiteboard had been updated overnight, names listed cleanly in blue marker with time blocks down the left side. In the middle column, next to route lead, was a new entry not printed, but penciled in careful block letters, IVY. Her tide chart was already pinned to the map wall. Not her notebook, not her field sketches, but the actual laminated chart she'd carried for 3 years. Someone had flattened it carefully, taping each corner with clean, precise lines. Her pencil contours showed clearly under the protective, coding the reef shelf curve, the trench marker, the notation in the bottom corner that read IVC in her own hand. A junior diver approached from the left, fins clipped under one arm. He stopped just short of her, then motioned toward the chart without quite meeting her eyes. "Is that your drift model?" he asked. She looked at him once, then reached into her pocket and handed him a folded printout, the latest route overlay copied from her personal archive of coastal surveys. "Thanks," he said, studying the technical notations with newfound respect. She turned away before he finished the word. Inside the tent, the morning team had begun to gather. Chairs scraped into position, tablets opened, and a coffee thermos hissed as someone twisted off the lid. Chief Wheeler walked in last, carrying the morning briefing slate. He nodded toward her as he passed a small gesture, but deliberate, and motioned to the wall. "Briefing," he said. She didn't hesitate. She stepped to the front and stood beside her tide chart as the room quieted without being asked. This was the moment she'd been preparing for during all those months of invisible preparation, not to prove them wrong, but to help them succeed. She tapped once near the trench marker. "The shelf is still unstable during surge, but the corridor is clear. If you pivot at 27 meters, you'll feel it before you see it. Let the current push you through the ridge gap, it will level you out naturally. Don't fight it." One diver leaned forward, tapping his pen against his chair arm. "You reading the entry?" Ivy looked at him, then at the chart. Only if they're listening. No one laughed. The room had shifted into the focused attention of professionals learning something they needed to know. She continued the briefing without pause. No dramatics, no personal vindication. Just clear technical information delivered by someone who understood the water better than their equipment did. Final approach procedures. Signal anchor points. Contour tracking. Oxygen load expectations for variable surge conditions. It was quiet, methodical, and thorough, the briefing of someone who'd done this work when lives actually depended on getting it right. When she finished, one of the senior instructors nodded slightly, making notes on his tablet. Chief Wheeler stepped forward to continue with team assignments, but he paused first, reaching into his vest pocket. He pulled out something small and folded a cloth patch with a blue background, stitched with a thin reef line in silver thread and a trench symbol in gray. No rank, no name, just the emblem of the dive corridor that would now be officially known by the model she'd created. He extended it to her. She took it without ceremony, studied it for a moment, then slipped it into her pocket rather than pinning it to her vest. The gesture wasn't dismissive, it was personal. This wasn't about displaying authority. It was about carrying responsibility. Wheeler stepped back and continued with the rotation assignments. Ivy didn't stay for the full briefing. When her copy of the route printout was distributed and logged, she quietly folded her version and returned it to her pocket. Her name was already coded into the sonar grid's firmware VC, hard-coded into the beacon ping setting she'd verified that morning. Outside, the dock was brighter. The sun had burned off the last haze, and the water moved gently against the pylons. Ivy walked the length of the platform edge without hurrying. A pair of instructors stood near the ladder platform, and one lifted his hand slightly when he saw her, a greeting balanced between recognition and respect. She acknowledged it with a nod. Not everyone understood what had changed, but those who needed to did. The invisible woman who'd calibrated their equipment and rewrapped their cables had revealed herself to be someone they couldn't afford to overlook. She stopped briefly at the gear rack where her harness hung in place dry now. Seals rechecked, rigging folded exactly as she'd left it. Her tools sat in the crate below, untouched but somehow more significant than they'd been 24 hours. Earlier, a boat engine started at the far end of the channel. Divers moved toward it in pairs, fins and clipboards tucked under their arms. The last man to step onto the boarding ramp looked back at her once, not in question, just in awareness. She didn't return the look, but she felt the weight of it. The compound didn't pause for her, but it made room. And for someone who'd spent months being invisible, that shift in the atmosphere was more valuable than any formal recognition could have been. Ivy turned and headed toward the administration trail, her dry bag secure, her equipment accounted for, and her expertise finally acknowledged by the people who needed it most. She'd asked for nothing, proven everything, and earned her place without demanding it. It was enough. More than enough. It was exactly what she'd been working toward during all those quiet months of preparation. Not vindication, but utility. Not recognition, but respect. And in the world she'd chosen to inhabit, respect was the only currency that truly mattered. The room hadn't changed. Same narrow walls, same salt-streaked corners, same small window with its stubborn curtain. But when Ivy stepped inside that evening, something felt different. The space seemed less like quarters assigned to someone forgotten and more like the private workspace of someone essential. She dropped her dry bag onto the table and unzipped it slowly. Inside, wrapped carefully in waterproof fabric, was a printout she'd never expected to see. The official dive protocol update, signed by Base Commander Captain Morris and distributed to all active units. Her tide charts weren't just pinned to the briefing room wall anymore. They were incorporated into standing orders. Section 4.2 now read, Coastal trench operations will utilize Carter methodology for current prediction and approach vectors. Section 4.2, not buried in appendices or referenced as supplemental material, but embedded in core operational procedure. She set the paper aside and reached for her notebook, the same soft-covered volume that had traveled with her through 3 duty stations. But tonight, as she opened it and smoothed the pages, it felt less like a personal archive and more like official documentation. Her handwritten observations were becoming institutional knowledge. From beneath the cot, she pulled out the cloth-wrapped brass weight, the piece of prototype equipment she'd salvaged from her old program. As it rolled warm in her palm, she realized it no longer represented what she'd lost. Instead, it marked what she'd carried forward, the knowledge that institutions discard and individuals preserve. 3 soft knocks at her door interrupted the quiet. Ivy set the weight aside and opened the door to find Petty Officer Marcus Reeves' no relation to her former commander, but coincidentally sharing the name of someone who'd valued her work. He stood at attention, holding a sealed envelope. "Ma'am, Chief Wheeler asked me to deliver this personally." She took the envelope, noted its official weight and the embossed seal of Naval Special Operations Command. "Thank you, Petty Officer." He didn't leave immediately. "Ma'am, if I may, what you did yesterday, with the trench recovery, my instructor said it was the cleanest nav work he'd seen in 10 years. Your instructor was being generous." "No, ma'am, he wasn't." Reeves shifted slightly, then added, "Half the guys in my unit have been asking about your charts. Word is you've been mapping sections that aren't in any official survey." Ivy studied his face, young, earnest, the kind of diver who understood that good intelligence kept people alive. "What's your unit working on, Petty Officer?" "Coastal reconnaissance, ma'am. We've been getting inconsistent readings off Point Loma for 3 months. Equipment checks out fine, but the bottom contours don't match what we're seeing." She stepped back from the doorway. "Come in." Reeves entered the small room, his eyes immediately drawn to the notebook open on the table. Ivy flipped to a section marked San Diego Approaches and traced a pencil line with her finger. "There's a seasonal shelf shift that happens twice a year," she said. "The official charts don't account for it because the survey was done during stable periods. Your readings are probably accurate. The bottom is changing." His eyes widened slightly as he studied her notations. "How long have you been tracking this?" 4 years. Every unit that's worked that area has complained about inconsistent data, but no one connects the reports because they come through different channels. Would you be willing to brief our team?" Ivy looked at him for a long moment, then at the official envelope still in her hand. "Talk to Chief Wheeler first. If he approves it, I'll share what I have." After Reeves left, she opened the sealed envelope. Inside was a single sheet of Navy letterhead, brief and direct. "Miss Carter, effective immediately, you are reassigned to Special Operations Dive Support, attached to SEAL Team 7 with advisory status. Your expertise in coastal navigation and current prediction is requested for ongoing operations. Report to Chief Wheeler Monday 0800 for mission briefing. Captain R. Morris, Base Commander." She read it twice, then set it beside her notebook. Not Lieutenant Commander Carter, her rank was still gone, stripped away with her security clearance and her official position, but advisory status meant something different. It meant they wanted her knowledge without the bureaucratic complications of reinstating her commission. It was, she realized, exactly what she would have asked for if she'd thought to ask. A second knock interrupted her thoughts. This time, it was Chief Wheeler himself, standing in her doorway with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You got the orders," he said, nodding toward the letter. "Yes, Chief. I want to be clear about something." He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. 6 months ago, When you first showed up here, I thought you were dead weight. Someone's mistake that got dumped on my unit. Ivy waited. She'd learned that silence often revealed more than questions. I was wrong, Wheeler continued. Yesterday proved that. But more than that, I had my people pull your service record. Your actual record, not the summary they gave us. Her chest tightened slightly. And 87 successful recovery dives, 12 commendations for technical innovation, 3 life-saving actions under combat conditions. His voice carried the weight of someone discovering he'd underestimated an asset. They didn't reassign you because you failed. They reassigned you because the program you were developing was working too well. Ivy kept her expression neutral, but inside, something loosened that had been tight for months. Someone had finally connected the dots between her dismissal and the politics that drove it. The prototype recovery program was showing results that made conventional methods look obsolete. Wheeler continued. Your success threatened existing. Contracts, established procedures, career tracks for people who'd invested in the old ways. That's not my concern anymore, Chief. Maybe it should be. He moved closer to the table, where her notebook lay open to detailed coastal surveys. Because what you've documented here, it's not just useful for training exercises. We've got real operations coming up that could use this kind of precision. She closed the notebook carefully. What kind of operations? The kind where being wrong about current patterns gets people killed. His tone was matter-of-fact, professional. The kind where your knowledge could be the difference between mission success and body recovery. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of that responsibility settling between them. Finally, Wheeler reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, a laminated ID card with her photo and the designation. Special Operations. Advisor, this gets you access to briefings, equipment, and operational planning. It doesn't restore your rank, but it gives you authority where it matters. She took the card, noting the magnetic strip and access codes that would open doors. That had been close to her for months. What do you need from me? Everything you've got. Every chart, every observation, every piece of data you've collected on your own time. He paused. And I need you to understand that once you're briefed on active operations, there's no going back to being invisible. Ivy looked around her small room, at the brass weight sitting beside her notebook, at the folded tide charts, at the dive harness hanging on its hook. All the knowledge she'd preserved during months of exile was about to become operational intelligence again. I understand, she said. Wheeler nodded and moved toward the door. Monday morning, 0800. Bring everything. He paused with his hand on the handle. And Ivy, thank you for not walking away when we gave you every reason to. After he left, she sat on the edge of her cot and looked at the ID card in her hands. Special Operations Advisor. It wasn't the same as Lieutenant. Commander wasn't the same as program leadership, but it was something different, something that might be better. She'd been cast out from an institution that valued conformity over innovation. Now she was being invited into a world that valued results over protocol. The transition felt like surfacing from a long, deep dive emerging into light that was brighter than what she'd left behind. Outside her window, the base settled into evening rhythm. But inside, Ivy began the process of organizing 4 years of personal research into operational intelligence. The invisible woman was about to become very visible indeed. And for the first time in months, that prospect didn't worry her. It excited her. Monday morning arrived with fog so thick it turned the harbor lights into smudged halos. Ivy walked through the gray pre-dawn toward the classified briefing facility, her credentials opening doors that had been locked to her since her reassignment. The building felt different from the training compounds, quieter, more serious, filled with the weight of operations that actually mattered. Chief Wheeler met her at the security checkpoint, his expression more focused than she'd seen before. Coffee? He offered, gesturing toward a break area where several other personnel moved with the subdued efficiency of people preparing for something significant. Thank you. She accepted the cup and followed him down a corridor lined with situation. Rooms. Through open doorways, she glimpsed maps marked with classifications she hadn't seen in months. Screens displaying satellite imagery and the kind of detailed planning that preceded real-world missions. Before we go in, Wheeler said, stopping. Outside conference room C. I want you to know what you're walking into. 3 days ago, a cargo vessel went down off the Baja Peninsula. Officially, it was carrying agricultural equipment. Unofficially, it was transporting prototype guidance. Systems for submarine-launched missiles. Ivy felt the familiar tightness of operational focus settling over her. Recovery mission? The wreckage is in Mexican territorial waters, but the current is carrying debris toward our ease. We have a narrow window to locate and secure the sensitive materials before they drift into international salvage territory. He opened the door. The problem is that every model we've run shows the debris field scattering in different directions. The conference room contained a dozen personnel she didn't recognize: intelligence analysts, mission planners, senior diving specialists from multiple units. At the front, a large screen displayed bathymetric charts of the Baja coastal region, overlaid with current prediction models that clearly conflicted with each other. Captain Morris stood as they entered. Miss Carter, thank you for joining us. I believe you've already identified our problem. She studied the screen, noting immediately where the official models diverged from what she knew about seasonal patterns in that region. The models aren't accounting for the thermal layer shifts that happen during winter months. The current isn't moving in a single direction. It's creating a spiral pattern that concentrates debris rather than scattering it. A lieutenant commander from Naval Intelligence leaned forward. Concentrates where? Ivy approached the screen and traced a circle with her finger around an area the model showed as empty water. Here, there's a natural collection point where 3 currents converge. Anything that goes down in the primary debris field will eventually migrate to this location. The room was silent as the implications settled. If she was right, the recovery operation could focus on a specific target area instead of searching hundreds of square miles of ocean. If she was wrong, they'd waste critical time while sensitive technology drifted beyond recovery. What's your confidence level? Captain Morris asked. 90%, she replied without hesitation. I've tracked similar patterns during research dives in that region. The convergence is predictable and consistent. A senior analyst pulled up historical recovery data on his tablet. We have records of 3 previous salvage operations in that area. All reported finding more debris than expected in the northern quadrant. That's the convergence point, Ivy confirmed. The current creates a natural collecting pool. Anything denser than seawater accumulates there over a 48 to 72-hour period. Chief Wheeler stepped closer to the screen. How do we approach it? That convergence zone is going to have strong downward currents. You don't fight it, Ivy said. You use it. Enter from the southeast. Let the current carry you into the collection zone. Then use controlled descent to break free. The guidance. Systems will be sitting on the bottom in approximately 40 meters of water, protected by the natural depression. Captain Morris exchanged glances with his intelligence officer. Miss Carter, would you be willing to serve as navigation specialist for this operation? The question hung in the air with the weight of months of preparation leading to this moment. Real mission. Real consequences. Real opportunity to prove that her knowledge was worth more than the bureaucratic politics that had sidelined her. Yes, sir. Outstanding. Morris turned to address the room. Operation DriftNet is now active. Miss Carter will provide navigation and current analysis. Chief Wheeler will lead the dive team. Intelligence estimates we have a 60-hour window before the debris field becomes inaccessible. The briefing continued for 2 more hours, covering weather windows, equipment requirements, diplomatic considerations, and contingency plans. But Ivy's focus was on the water, visualizing the way currents moved in that region, the way debris would tumble and settle, the precise timing required to reach the convergence zone during the optimal collection period. As the meeting broke up, she found herself surrounded by specialists who wanted to discuss technical details. For the first time in months, her knowledge was driving operational planning rather than being dismissed as anecdotal observation. Miss Carter called Lieutenant Sarah Webb, a diving officer from the Pacific Fleet. "I've read the reports about your prototype recovery work. Is it true you developed new techniques for deep debris navigation? Some modifications to existing procedures," Ivy replied. "Nothing revolutionary, just adapted to specific conditions. Could you brief our technical team? We're always looking for improved methodologies." Before Ivy could answer, Chief Wheeler approached. "Save the technical discussions for after the mission. Right now, I need her focused on getting my people down and back up safely." Webb nodded apologetically and stepped away, but not before, adding, "I'd like to continue this conversation later, if you're willing." As the room cleared, Captain Morris approached with a folder marked with security classifications. "Your operational authority, Ms. Carter. This gives you mission planning input and direct communication with dive teams during operations." She opened the folder to find temporary credentials that restored most of her former access privileges. Not permanently, but for the duration of Operation Driftnet. It was more trust than anyone had placed in her since her reassignment. "Sir, I won't let you down. I don't expect you to." Morris paused at the door. "Miss Carter, what happened to your previous program? The politics that ended it. That has nothing to do with your capabilities. This mission will demonstrate what the Navy should have recognized months ago." After he left, Ivy stood alone in the conference room, looking at the bathymetric charts that would guide tomorrow's operation. The invisible woman who'd spent months organizing equipment and refolding cables was now the navigation specialist for a classified recovery mission. But more than that, she was about to prove that real expertise couldn't be bureaucratized away. That knowledge earned in the field was worth more than assumptions made in offices. That sometimes the person everyone overlooks is the one person who can see clearly. The fog outside was beginning to lift, revealing the harbor where dive boats were already being prepared for departure. In 18 hours, she'd be back in the water, doing the work she was trained for, trusted with the lives of people who'd finally learned to value what she brought to the mission. It felt like coming home. The Pacific stretched endlessly under the pre-dawn sky as the dive vessel Resolute cut through swells 30 miles off the Baja Peninsula. Ivy stood at the stern, watching the wake spread behind them in a perfect V, her hands steady on a navigation tablet displaying real-time current data. The convergence zone lay 8 miles ahead, exactly where her calculations had predicted. Current readings confirmed. She called to Chief Wheeler at the helm. "Convergence is active and stable. Collection zone should be optimal in 90 minutes. The dive team moved with quiet efficiency around her, checking equipment, reviewing approach vectors, preparing for a mission that would either validate months of her work or expose her to the kind of failure that ended careers permanently. But Ivy felt calm, centered in the way that came from absolute certainty about water and current and the predictable patterns that govern both. Petty Officer Reeves approached with his dive computer already configured. "Ma'am, thermal layer is holding steady at 38 meters. Visibility should be good until we hit the debris field. It'll get murky when you reach the collection zone," she warned. "The convergence creates a lot of suspended sediment. Navigate by feel and compass heading. Don't rely on visual confirmation." The first dive team entered the water at precisely 0647 hours, just as the current rotation reached optimal strength. Ivy monitored their descent from the surface, tracking their progress against her predicted drift patterns. Everything was unfolding exactly as her models had forecast. Team 1 at 30 meters came the report through the communications array. Following the southeast approach vector, current is, wow, it's pulling us exactly where she said it. Wood. Wheeler keyed the radio. Stay with the drift. Don't fight it until you reach the target zone. Ivy watched the sonar display as the divers moved through the convergence zone, their signals clustering in the natural depression she'd identified. Then, at exactly 42 meters depth, the readings changed. Contact. The diver's voice crackled with excitement. Multiple metallic objects scattered across approximately 50 square meters. This is definitely our debris field. The recovery operation that followed was textbook perfect. Guided by Ivy's current analysis, the dive teams located and secured 7 containers of classified guidance systems, working efficiently in the natural collection zone that had concentrated the scattered debris exactly as she'd predicted. But the real vindication came during the ascent. Following her instructions, the divers used the convergence current itself to assist their return journey, riding the spiral pattern to the surface instead of fighting against it. What should have been an exhausting 45-minute ascent became a controlled 20-minute ride. Outstanding work. Captain Morris's voice came through the secure channel from base operations. All objectives secured, all personnel accounted for. Operation DriftNet is complete. As the Resolute turned toward home, Chief Wheeler found Ivy at the stern rail, looking out over the water that had just provided the final proof of her expertise. "You know what happens now?" he said. "The guidance systems get analyzed, the mission gets classified, and we go back to routine training exercises," she replied. "Maybe. Or maybe the Navy realizes it has someone who understands the ocean better than their computer models do." He handed her an official folder marked with her name. "Captain Morris asked me to give you this." Inside was a letter from Naval Personnel Command, brief, formal, and completely unexpected. "Ms. Carter, based on operational performance and recommendation from Special Operations Command, you are hereby offered reinstatement to active duty with the rank of Lieutenant Commander. Effective immediately. Assignment: Chief Naval Advisor for Underwater Navigation and Recovery Operations, Pacific Fleet. This position carries full authority for developing operational protocols and training standards for underwater recovery missions across all Pacific Command units. Response requested within 72 hours. Ivy read it twice, then looked out over the ocean where she'd just proven that knowledge preserved through patience could triumph over institutional blindness. "They're offering me my rank back," she said quietly. "More than that," Wheeler replied. "They're offering you a position where your expertise shapes policy instead of being ignored by it. You'd be developing the procedures that other units follow." She thought about the narrow room she'd called home for months, the quiet evenings spent maintaining knowledge no one asked for, the careful preparation that had led to this moment. Then she thought about Petty Officer Reeves and Lieutenant Webb, and all the other young personnel who could benefit from navigation training that actually reflected how the ocean worked. "I'll need access to all historical dive data for the Pacific region," she said finally, "and authority to conduct field research in areas where current models are inadequate." Wheeler smiled. "I think that can be arranged." The Resolute docked at Coronado as the sun reached its zenith, painting the harbor in brilliant gold. Ivy walked down the gangway carrying the same weathered equipment case she'd brought to the base months earlier, but everything else had changed. Personnel who'd once dismissed her now nodded with genuine respect. Officers who'd questioned her qualifications now sought her input on their own operations. As she reached the dock, she found an unexpected reception waiting, not an official ceremony, but something more meaningful. 24 SEALs from various units had gathered near the staging tent, standing at loose attention. They didn't salute, but they formed a pathway from the gangway to the shore. It was acknowledgement, recognition, the quiet respect of professionals who understood that competence was earned in the field, not assigned in offices. Ivy walked through the pathway without hurry, her spine straight, her expression composed. She'd spent months being invisible, overlooked, dismissed as support staff. Now she was returning as an expert whose knowledge had just saved a classified mission and whose future would shape how the Navy approached underwater operations. At the end of the pathway, Chief Wheeler waited with her reassignment orders and the patch she'd earned months earlier: blue background, silver reef line, gray trench symbol. This time, she pinned it to her collar immediately, not as decoration but as identification. She was no longer someone seeking recognition. She was someone whose expertise spoke for itself. "Welcome back, Lieutenant Commander Carter," Wheeler said formally. "Thank you, Chief." She looked around at the faces surrounding her, some familiar, some new, all marked by the understanding that they'd witnessed something significant. "Now let's get to work. We have a lot of training to update." The base returned to its normal rhythm, but with a difference that everyone could feel. The invisible woman who'd spent months organizing equipment and mapping currents had emerged as the navigation specialist who could succeed where others failed. Her patient preparation had created the moment when being forgotten became her greatest advantage. 3 months later, when the Navy's new underwater navigation protocols were published, protocols based entirely on her research and field experience, Ivy was already deep in her next project, training the next generation of divers to read water the way she'd learned to read it, with patience, precision, and a kind of expertise that couldn't be bureaucratized away. She'd walk the dock alone until the moment when silence became the only voice that mattered. Now she'd led others down the same path, teaching them that real mastery was quiet, enduring, and impossible to overlook once it chose to be seen. The ocean had always known who she was. It had just taken everyone else a while to catch up. Sometimes the person everyone overlooks is the one person who sees everything clearly. Ivy Carter didn't fight for permission or demand recognition. She prepared in silence, acted when others couldn't, and earned her place through discipline and expertise that couldn't be denied. Her story reminds us that strength doesn't always announce itself, that mastery doesn't need validation, and that patience combined with competence can overcome any institutional blindness. The next time you feel unseen or undervalued, remember, you don't have to speak loudly to make an impact. Sometimes the most powerful voice is the one that waits for exactly the right moment to be heard. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.